Whispers followed Cherish through every muddy street of Oakhaven. 19 suitors had turned their backs, leaving her labeled the town's cursed spinster. No one knew the terrifying secret she carried until a rugged stranger from the unforgiving peaks walked into the saloon, changing her destiny entirely. Cherish Josephine Young was 24 years old, though the harsh Wyoming sun and the endless burden of isolation had etched the weariness of a much older woman into her striking features. She possessed a quiet, unassuming beauty, auburn hair that caught the amber light of the setting sun, and eyes the color of a stormy prairie sky. Yet, in the bustling timber and mining town of Oakhaven, beauty mattered little when attached to a name steeped in misfortune. Every morning, Cherish walked the 2 miles from her dilapidated homestead on the edge of the valley into town to deliver her fresh eggs, milk, and hand-sewn garments. She walked with her head held high, ignoring the sudden hushes that fell over the general store, the knowing glances exchanged by the sheriff's deputies, and the cruel smirks of the saloon girls. She was the town pariah, the cursed woman. The curse, according to local gossip, was simple. Any man who courted Cherish Young was doomed to ruin. It had begun 5 years ago, shortly after the tragic fire that claimed her father's life and burned their once prosperous ranch to the ground. Cherish had emerged from the flames with blistered hands and a shadow over her soul. Soon after, the suitors came calling. Cherish was, after all, the sole inheritor of a sprawling, albeit ruined, parcel of prime grazing land. The first man to ask for her hand was a promising young blacksmith named Thomas. 2 days after his proposal, his forge mysteriously collapsed, crippling his dominant arm. The town whispered it was bad luck. Then came a handsome cattle drover named Henry. He courted her for a month, but on the eve of his proposal, his entire herd was poisoned by bitterweed. He left town without a word to her. One by one, they tried. One by one, they met disaster, financial ruin, or sudden, inexplicable terror. By the time the 19th suitor, a timid schoolteacher named Arthur, fled Oakhaven in the middle of the night, leaving behind a frantic note about shadows at his window, the legend was cemented. Cherish was poison. However, the truth of Cherish's curse was not supernatural. It bore a name: Jackson Reynolds. Jackson was the wealthy heir to the Oakhaven Bank and Trust, a man whose tailored Eastern suits could not hide the cruel, possessive tilt of his jaw. He had decided long ago that Cherish would belong to him, not as a respected wife, but as a broken, submissive mistress. When she had vehemently rejected him, spitting at his feet on the smoldering ashes of her father's home, Jackson made a silent vow. If he could not have her willingly, he would isolate her until she had no choice but to crawl to his doorstep begging for salvation. He used his wealth and influence to destroy anyone who looked her way. He paid off debts to break Thomas's forge, hired hands to poison Henry's cattle, and sent thugs to terrorize Arthur, the schoolteacher. Cherish knew it was Jackson. She knew the blood and the ruin were on his hands, but she had no proof, no allies, and no way out. The sheriff was in Jackson's pocket, and the town was too blinded by superstition to see the tyrant operating in plain sight. So, she endured. She built an impenetrable wall around her heart, accepting her fate as a lonely spinster. She would rather die alone in the Wyoming cold than surrender to the monster who had likely orchestrated the fire that killed her father. It was on a bitter Tuesday in late October when the rhythm of her despair was finally disrupted. The bells above Elias Tucker's mercantile chimed, slicing through the tense silence that always accompanied Cherish's presence in the store. Cherish was at the counter, counting out copper pennies for a bag of flour, while Martha Higgins, the town's chief gossip, loudly complained about the stench of bad luck in the aisles. The heavy wooden door swung open, bringing with it a gust of freezing mountain air, and a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite of the Absaroka Range. He was towering, standing well over 6 feet, with a broad chest draped in a worn buffalo hide coat. His hair was dark and unruly, brushing the collar of a faded flannel shirt, and a thick beard obscured the lower half of his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Cherish's breath in her throat. They were a piercing, vibrant green like the heart of a deep pine forest, and they swept over the room with the predatory calmness of a mountain lion. He carried a heavy bundle of premium beaver and wolf pelts over one massive shoulder. This was Huxley Boone. Huxley had lived in the high country for 6 years, trading only when necessary, preferring the honest brutality of the wild to the deceitful smiles of civilized men. He stepped into the mercantile, ignoring the stares of the townsfolk, and dropped his pelts onto the counter next to Cherish's meager pile of coppers. The sheer weight of the furs made the solid oak counter groan. Elias Tucker swallowed hard, wiping his hands on his apron. Mr. Boone, ain't expected you till the first snow." Huxley's voice was a low, resonant rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Cherish's very bones. "Snow's coming. 3 days. Brought the harvest early." As Elias frantically began appraising the pristine pelts, Martha Higgins scoffed loudly from the pickle barrels. "Watch your step, mountain man," she sneered, pointing a knobby finger at Cherish. "You're standing too close to Oakhaven's resident curse. She'll rot those furs just by looking at them." Cherish stiffened, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She reached for her flour sack, eager to flee, but her trembling fingers fumbled. The heavy sack tipped, and a cloud of white powder exploded across the floor, dusting her worn boots and the edge of Huxley's buffalo coat. A collective gasp echoed through the store. Elias froze. Everyone expected the mountain man to erupt in a violent rage. The men of the frontier were not known for their patience. Cherish squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a frantic, "I am so sorry, sir. I'll clean it." She dropped to her knees, frantically trying to scoop the ruined flour back into the torn canvas. Humiliation tasted like ash on her tongue. Suddenly, a massive, calloused hand entered her vision. It wasn't raised to strike her. It was offered to her. Cherish looked up. Huxley had crouched down beside her. Up close, she could see a jagged, white scar running from his temple to his cheekbone, a testament to a violent past. Yet, his green eyes held no pity, no anger, only an intense, calculating respect. "Leave it," he said softly. His voice meant only for her. "It's just dust." "I have to pay for it," Cherish whispered, her voice cracking. "And I have no more coins." Huxley stood up smoothly, pulling her to her feet with a grip that was surprisingly gentle despite his immense strength. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a solid silver dollar, and tossed it onto the counter. It landed with a heavy, ringing thud. "The flour is paid for," Huxley told Elias, his gaze drifting to Martha Higgins with a chilling coldness. "And if that woman opens her mouth again, I'll buy her a muzzle." The store went dead silent. Cherish grabbed her newly replaced sack of flour and hurried out the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't look back, but as she walked the long, cold miles back to her ruined farm, she could feel the phantom warmth of Huxley Boone's hand on hers. 2 weeks passed. The snow Huxley had predicted arrived with vicious fury, blanketed the valley in a pristine, blinding white. The town of Oakhaven prepared for its annual winter solstice auction, a charity event meant to raise funds for the local schoolhouse. Women baked pies, crafted quilts, and prepared preserves, while men bid on the items to show their wealth and, often, to publicly announce their courtship intentions. Bidding high on a woman's basket was an undisputed declaration of serious intent. Cherish had not planned to attend, but the crushing weight of winter property taxes meant she had no choice. She spent days preparing her famous spiced blackberry preserves, carefully sealing them in glass jars wrapped in bright red ribbon. She hoped a sympathetic stranger passing through might buy them, unaware of her reputation. The town hall was suffocatingly warm, illuminated by dozens of oil lanterns and packed with the entire population of Oakhaven. Fiddles whined in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and cheap perfume. Cherish stood against the far wall, a shadow trying to shrink into the wood paneling. Across the room, Jackson Reynolds held court. He wore a velvet waistcoat and smoked a cigar, surrounded by his cronies. When his eyes locked onto Cherish, a cruel, predatory smile spread across his face. The auction began. Baskets of bread and beautifully stitched quilts were auctioned off to cheering crowds. Finally, Mayor Higgins held up Cherish's modest wooden crate of preserves. Next up, we have, the mayor hesitated, looking at the card. Spiced blackberry preserves by Miss Cherish Young. The room fell silent. The fiddles abruptly stopped playing. A heavy, suffocating tension settled over the hall. Cherish lowered her gaze, her nails digging into her palms. She prayed for silence. She prayed the mayor would just move on. "Do I hear a bid of $1? The mayor asked nervously. Nothing. The men stared at the floor. The women whispered behind their fans. Suddenly, Jackson Reynolds stepped forward, his boots clicking loudly against the floorboards. "I'll bid $1, Jackson announced, his voice dripping with mock generosity. "But Mayor, I must ask for a clarification on the terms of this auction." "What terms, Mr. Reynolds?" Jackson turned to face the crowd, ensuring everyone could hear him. He looked directly at Cherish. Usually, the highest bidder gets to share the meal with the lady who prepared it. But considering Miss Young's unfortunate history, I wonder if the winner shouldn't be entitled to a bit more. Say, the deed to her failing property? Or perhaps she'd be willing to sweep my floors for a year to pay off the bad luck she brings. Laughter erupted from Jackson's men, echoing painfully in Cherish's ears. It wasn't just humiliation. It was an execution of her dignity. He was reminding the town, and her, that she belonged to him. She was nothing but a punchline, a destitute creature he could purchase for $1. A young farmer named Daniel, who had smiled at Cherish earlier that morning, quickly stepped back into the crowd, visibly terrified of crossing Jackson. Cherish felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, preparing to walk out of the hall and leave her dignity in the dust. $50. The voice boomed from the back of the hall, cutting through the laughter like a rifle shot. The crowd parted instantly. Leaning casually against the heavy oak doors was Huxley Boone. He had shed his bulky buffalo coat, revealing broad shoulders clad in a tailored dark wool shirt and a leather vest. He looked less like a wild mountain man and more like an apex predator who had just entered a pen of trembling sheep. Jackson's smile vanished. "Excuse me?" Huxley pushed off the door and walked slowly down the center aisle. Every step he took seemed to suck the air out of the room. "I said $50 for the lady's preserves." The mayor nearly dropped his gavel. $50 was a small fortune, enough to buy a decent horse or several acres of land. Jackson's face flushed with anger. "Now listen here, mountain trash. This is a local auction. We don't need drifters inflating the bids. Besides, you don't know what you're buying. That woman is cursed. Every man who gets near her ends up broken or broke." Huxley stopped 5 feet from Jackson. Though Jackson was tall, Huxley towered over him, radiating a quiet, lethal energy. "I ain't afraid of curses, Reynolds," Huxley said softly, yet his voice carried to every corner of the room. "And I ain't afraid of the cowards who hide behind them." Jackson's fists clenched. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm bidding on the preserves," Huxley replied, his green eyes locked onto Jackson's in a silent challenge. "Unless you want to bid 51? Jackson scoffed, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He knew better than to pick a physical fight with a man who wrestled grizzly bears for sport. "Keep the cursed jam. You deserve each other." He turned and pushed his way through the crowd, his cronies trailing nervously behind him. Huxley walked up to the stunned mayor, placed a heavy leather pouch of gold coins on the podium, and picked up the crate of preserves. He didn't look at the crowd. He turned and walked directly toward Cherish. She was frozen, her heart beating so wildly she thought it might shatter her ribs. Huxley stopped in front of her. "Miss Young," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I believe it's tradition for the winner to escort the lady home." Cherish swallowed hard, looking up into his scarred face. You shouldn't have done that. You made an enemy of Jackson Reynolds. He's a dangerous man." Huxley offered her his arm. "I've survived blizzards, avalanches, and wolf packs, Cherish. A man in a velvet vest doesn't scare me." For the first time in 5 years, Cherish reached out and took a man's arm. As they walked out of the town hall together, leaving the stunned silence of Oak Haven behind them, Cherish felt a strange, terrifying sensation bloom in her chest. It felt terrifyingly like hope. The walk back to Cherish's homestead was steeped in a heavy, contemplative silence. The winter moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered plains. Huxley walked beside her, carrying the crate of preserves with effortless grace. He didn't barrage her with questions. He didn't brag about humiliating Jackson. He simply walked, a solid, grounding presence against the biting wind. When they finally reached the boundaries of her property, the atmosphere shifted. The charred, blackened skeleton of her father's old barn stood out starkly against the white snow, a grim monument to the night her life had shattered. Cherish stopped at the edge of her frozen porch, turning to face him. The cold was biting, but her blood was rushing with a mix of adrenaline and deep-seated fear. She had to warn him. She couldn't let another innocent man fall victim to Jackson's wrath because of her. "Mr. Boone," she began, her voice trembling slightly in the frigid air. "I appreciate what you did tonight. I truly do. It was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in years. But you need to leave. You need to take your furs and your gold and ride back up into the mountains." Huxley set the wooden crate gently on the porch steps. "Huxley, call me Huxley. And I ain't leaving, Cherish. I came down from the mountain for a reason." "You don't understand," Cherish cried, the frustration finally breaking through her stoic facade. She pointed toward the burnt ruins of the barn. "They call me cursed. 19 men, Huxley. 19 men have tried to help me, tried to court me, and every single one of them was destroyed. Thomas lost his arm. Henry lost his livelihood. Arthur nearly lost his mind. Jackson Reynolds will not let anyone have me, and he will not let me leave. If you stay anywhere near me, he will destroy you too." She expected him to look shocked. She expected the sudden dawn of realization to hit his face, followed by the inevitable retreat. She braced herself for him to tip his hat, mutter an apology, and disappear into the night like all the rest. Instead, Huxley took a slow step closer. He reached out, his massive fingers gently brushing the snow from the frayed collar of her coat. His green eyes were dark, swirling with an intelligence and sorrow that caught her completely off guard. He didn't ask her to marry him. He didn't pledge his undying protection or boast about his ability to kill Jackson. He looked directly into the shattered remnants of her soul and he asked her one question. "Why are you letting them punish you for a fire they started?" The words hit Cherish with the force of a physical blow. The breath vanished from her lungs. She stumbled back a step, her eyes wide with shock and terror. "What? What did you say?" "I asked," Huxley repeated, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. "Why you are serving a life sentence for a crime Jackson Reynolds committed." "How do you know that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "No one knows that. Everyone says my father knocked over a lantern. They said he was drunk." "Your father wasn't drunk," Huxley said firmly. 5 years ago, before I moved to the High Peaks, I was a Pinkerton agent out of Denver. I came through Oakhaven, tracking a gang of cattle rustlers. The night your farm burned, I was camped on the ridge 2 miles west of here." Cherish's hands flew to her mouth, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her frozen cheeks. "I saw the riders, Cherish," Huxley continued, his tone filled with regret. "I saw 5 men on horseback carrying torches. I saw them bar the doors of that barn from the outside before they set it ablaze. By the time I rode down, it was too late. The roof had collapsed. I found you in the snow, screaming for him." "You," Cherish gasped, sobbing. "You were the man who pulled me away from the embers. I always thought it was a neighbor. I thought it was a dream." "It was me," Huxley said, stepping closer and taking both of her trembling, scarred hands in his. He looked down at the pale burn marks on her wrists, treating them with a reverence no one had ever shown her. "I tracked those riders the next day. I followed their horses straight back to the stables behind the Oakhaven Bank, to Jackson Reynolds." Cherish shook her head violently, the suppressed trauma of half a decade bursting to the surface. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you arrest him?" "I tried," Huxley admitted, a bitter edge to his voice. "I went to the territorial marshal. I wired my superiors in Denver. But Reynolds' money ran deep. He owned the local judges, he owned the marshal, and he bought off my agency superiors. They ordered me to drop it. When I refused, they fired me and put a bounty on my head for insubordination. Disgusted by the whole damn civilized world, I walked up into the Absaroka Mountains and swore I'd never come back down. He squeezed her hands gently, forcing her to look up into his fierce green eyes. But I never forgot you, Cherish. For 5 years, the memory of you surviving that night haunted me. I came down this winter because I heard the rumors. I heard about the curse of Oakhaven. I realized Jackson wasn't just getting away with murder. He was holding you hostage in an invisible cage, destroying anyone who tried to free you. Cherish collapsed against him, her strength finally giving out. Huxley caught her, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her into the solid, warm expanse of his chest. She wept for her father, for the years of isolation, for the 19 men who had suffered for trying to love her, and for the sheer relief of finally being heard. He's going to kill us, Cherish sobbed into his coat. If you know the truth, and I know the truth, he won't stop until we are dead. Huxley rested his chin on the top of her head, his eyes fixed on the charred ruins of the barn in the distance. The mountain man who had retreated from the world was gone. The Pinkerton detective who sought justice had awakened. No, Cherish, Huxley whispered, his voice as cold and sharp as the mountain ice. Jackson Reynolds thinks he's a wolf among sheep, but he's about to learn what happens when you draw a grizzly out of the high country. I didn't come down from that mountain to die. He pulled back slightly, looking deeply into her tear-streaked face. I came down to burn his empire to the ground. Will you help me strike the match? Cherish looked at the scarred, relentless man standing before her. For 5 years, she had been a victim of a ghost story crafted by a murderer. The town saw her as a broken curse, but Huxley Boone saw her as a survivor. He had asked her the one question that broke the illusion of her guilt. She wiped the tears from her face, her jaw setting with a newfound, terrifying resolve. The frightened spinster was gone. Yes, Cherish breathed, her stormy eyes hardening to steel. We'll burn it all. The days that followed were a masterclass in preparation and survival. Huxley Boone did not merely move into Cherish's drafty homestead, he fortified it. The mountain man and former Pinkerton agent understood that Jackson Reynolds would not let a public humiliation at the winter auction go unpunished. Jackson operated on fear and absolute control, and Huxley had just shattered both in front of the entire town of Oakhaven. They had to force Jackson's hand, drawing him out of the safety of his bank and into a battleground they controlled. Cherish, who had spent 5 years shrinking away from the world, found a fierce, dormant courage awakening within her. Huxley did not treat her like a fragile, cursed thing. He treated her like an equal, a partner in a deadly game of chess. To prepare for the inevitable retaliation, Huxley transformed the perimeter of the young farm. The perimeter snare. He rigged invisible tripwires across the main snow-covered access roads, connecting them to heavy iron cowbells hidden high in the frosted branches of the cottonwood trees. The decoy. He built a robust fire in the ruined hearth of the burnt barn, making it look as though they were excavating the ashes at night. The arsenal. He laid out a pristine array of weaponry on Cherish's kitchen table, 2 Colt revolvers, a lever-action Winchester rifle, and his own custom-weighted hunting knives. On the 3rd night, under the glow of a kerosene lamp, Huxley handed Cherish the Winchester. He stood behind her, his broad chest pressed against her back, as he guided her hands along the cold steel of the barrel. You don't look at the whole target, Huxley murmured, his breath warm against her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the Wyoming cold. You focus on the center. You control your breathing. When the time comes, Cherish, you don't hesitate. Survival belongs to those who act. I've never shot a man, Huxley, Cherish whispered, her hands gripping the woodstock tightly. I pray you won't have to, he replied gently. But Jackson relies on the fact that you won't fight back. We are going to change the rules. The trap they set was psychological. Cherish rode into town the next morning, her head held high. She walked straight into the telegraph office, a business heavily monitored by Jackson's informants, and paid the operator to send a wired message to a fictitious lawyer in Denver. Have found father's hidden lockbox in the barn ruins. Contains the ledger pages and the deed agreements. Proof of arson secured. Will bring them to the capital on the morning train. It was a bluff. A piece of bait dangled directly in front of a starving wolf. Cherish knew the telegraph operator would immediately run a copy of the message to the Oakhaven Bank and Trust. The retaliation came swiftly, just as Huxley had calculated. It was past midnight when the heavy snowfall muffled the sound of approaching hooves, but it could not silence the sudden violent clatter of the iron cowbells ringing from the cottonwood trees. Inside the darkened cabin, Huxley's eyes snapped open. He was already out of his bedroll, his Colt revolver drawn. He looked across the room to Cherish, who was sitting up, gripping the Winchester. She nodded, her face pale but resolute in the moonlight filtering through the frost-bitten windows. Outside, 4 armed men dismounted at the edge of the property. They were Jackson's hired muscle, led by a ruthless enforcer named Jebediah Rust. They carried crowbars, rope, and a gallon of kerosene. Their orders were clear: find the lockbox, silence the mountain man, and finish the job they had started on the Young family 5 years ago. Spread out, Jebediah hissed, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Check the barn first. If they're digging in the ashes, we burn 'em in it. Jebediah kicked the charred doors of the ruined barn open, stepping into the darkness. 2 of his men followed. Suddenly, a heavy wooden beam, rigged to a sophisticated counterweight pulley system Huxley had constructed, swung down from the rafters. It slammed into the 2 trailing men, sweeping them off their feet and sending them crashing into the frozen dirt, out cold. Jebediah spun around, raising his shotgun, but a shadow dropped from the loft above. Huxley landed soundlessly, his massive arm wrapping around Jebediah's throat, while his other hand easily stripped the shotgun from the enforcer's grasp. "You boys are making an awful lot of noise on private property," Huxley growled, pressing the cold steel of his hunting knife against Jebediah's carotid artery. The 4th man, waiting by the horses, heard the commotion and drew his pistol, sprinting toward the barn. He didn't make it halfway. The heavy door of the farmhouse kicked open, and Cherish stepped onto the porch. She raised the Winchester, exhaled exactly as Huxley had taught her, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the quiet night. The bullet buried itself into the wooden post merely an inch from the 4th man's head, showering his face with splinters. He screamed, dropping his weapon and throwing his hands in the air, terrified by the deadly accuracy of the cursed spinster. Inside the barn, Huxley tied Jebediah to a support beam. The enforcer was bleeding from a cut on his cheek, shivering violently in the cold. "You're a dead man, Boone," Jebediah spat. "Jackson owns this valley. He owns the sheriff. You can't touch him." Huxley crouched down, meeting Jebediah's panicked gaze with eyes like glacial ice. "I don't need to touch him, Jebediah. I just need you to tell me where he keeps the blackmail. A man like Reynolds doesn't pay for arson and murder on a handshake. He keeps a ledger. Where is it?" Jebediah clenched his jaw, shaking his head. "I don't know nothing about no ledger." Huxley sighed, standing up. He looked over his shoulder at Cherish, who had walked into the barn, the smoking rifle still in her hands. She looked down at the men who had terrorized her, the men who had murdered her father. The fear that had ruled her life was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. "Huxley," Cherish said smoothly, her voice echoing in the hollow ruins. "My father was trapped in here when the roof caught fire. I remember how quickly the dry hay went up." "Do we still have that kerosene?" Jebediah's eyes went wide. He looked from Cherish's stony face to Huxley's impassive stare. The mountain man merely shrugged, picking up the discarded gallon of kerosene. "Wait!" Jebediah screamed as Huxley uncapped the jug. "Wait! It's in the bank. It's not in the main vault. He has a false floor under his oak desk in the back office. It has a combination lock. All the bribes, the paid hits, the deeds he stole. It's all in a black leather book." Huxley secured the cap back on the kerosene. He looked at Cherish, a rare, genuine smile crossing his scarred face. She had bluffed the enforcer brilliantly. "Get the rope, Cherish," Huxley said. "We have a bank to visit before sunrise." Dawn broke over Oakhaven with a blinding, diamond-like clarity. The winter sun illuminated the snow-packed streets, but the town was unusually quiet. The sheriff and his deputies were huddled in the warmth of the jailhouse, unaware of the storm that was walking straight down Main Street. Cherish and Huxley did not sneak into town. They walked side by side down the center of the avenue, a striking picture of raw frontier vengeance. Huxley wore his heavy buffalo coat, leading Jebediah and the other three thugs, bound together by a thick hemp rope at the barrel of his revolver. Cherish walked beside him, her head held high, carrying her father's worn leather satchel. Townspeople peeked through frosted windows and stepped cautiously onto the boardwalks, murmuring in shock. The cursed woman and the mountain man were parading Jackson Reynolds' most feared enforcers through the mud. They marched straight to the Oakhaven Bank and Trust. Huxley kicked the heavy mahogany doors open, shattering the stained glass pane that bore Jackson's name. Inside, Jackson Reynolds was standing by a teller window, counting a stack of banknotes. He froze, his polished veneer cracking as he saw his battered men tied together like cattle. "What is the meaning of this?" Jackson roared, his face flushing crimson. "Sheriff! Somebody get the sheriff!" Huxley pushed Jebediah forward. The thug stumbled to his knees in front of the teller counter. "The sheriff can't help you today, Reynolds," Huxley rumbled, locking the bank doors behind them. Cherish stepped forward, bypassing Huxley entirely. She walked straight up to the iron grill, separating the lobby from the bank's offices. She looked Jackson dead in the eye. "We know about the false floor under your desk, Jackson," Cherish said, her voice carrying out to the streets, where a crowd was rapidly forming outside the shattered door. "We know about the black leather book." Jackson's confidence evaporated. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his eyes. He backed away from the counter, his hand dropping toward the pocket of his velvet waistcoat. "You're insane, both of you. You're a cursed, delusional spinster, and he's a wild animal. No judge will listen to you." "They won't have to listen to me," Huxley stated, stepping up beside Cherish. "Because I'm not just a mountain man, Reynolds. I was a Pinkerton. And yesterday, while you were busy reading Cherish's fake telegraph, I sent a real one to a federal judge in Cheyenne. I detailed the arson, the bribery of local officials, and the exact location of your hidden ledger." The crowd outside was pressing against the glass, listening intently. The whispers were changing. The myth of the curse was unraveling, exposing the ugly truth of corruption. "You're lying!" Jackson shouted, drawing a silver-plated derringer from his waistcoat. He aimed it directly at Cherish's chest. "I'll kill you both right here and say you tried to rob my bank." Time seemed to slow down. Huxley moved to intercept, diving in front of Cherish, but he didn't need to. Cherish, anticipating the coward's move, didn't flinch. She reached into her coat, drew the heavy Colt revolver Huxley had given her, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the heavy silver inkwell on the counter, shattering it into 1,000 pieces and sending a spray of sharp shrapnel and black ink directly into Jackson's face. Jackson screamed, dropping his small pistol as he clawed at his stinging eyes, stumbling backward until he collapsed into a crying, pathetic heap on the polished floor. The bank doors were suddenly shoved open from the outside. The local sheriff burst in, his gun drawn, but he froze when he saw the scene. Before the corrupt lawman could decide who to shoot, a sharp voice rang out from the doorway. "Drop the weapon, Sheriff." Standing in the threshold, flanked by 2 heavily armed deputies, was a United States federal marshal. He stepped into the bank, holding a yellow telegram paper. "Jackson Reynolds," the marshal declared, pulling a set of iron cuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest by order of the Federal Court of Wyoming for extortion, bribery, and the murder of Elias Young. And Sheriff, you're coming too." The town of Oakhaven watched in stunned silence as the wealthy tyrant, covered in black ink and sobbing, was dragged out of his own bank in irons. The local sheriff handed over his badge without a fight, the reign of terror broken in a matter of minutes. Inside the quieted bank, Huxley turned to Cherish. He slowly reached out, gently taking the smoking revolver from her trembling hand and tucking it into his belt. "You didn't shoot him," Huxley said, his green eyes gleaming with a mixture of immense pride and deep affection. "You told me not to hesitate," Cherish breathed, a beautiful, breathless smile breaking across her face for the first time in 5 years. But you also told me survival belongs to those who act. I didn't want him dead, Huxley. I wanted him to live in a cage, just like he made me do. Huxley smiled, reaching up to gently cup her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin, wiping away a speck of gunpowder. The curse is broken, Cherish Young. No, Cherish whispered, stepping closer, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against the solid warmth of his buffalo coat. There never was a curse. There was only waiting for the right man to ask the right question. Outside, the harsh winter wind seemed to settle, giving way to a bright, clear morning. The town of Oakhaven would never be the same, and neither would the rugged peaks above it. The mountain man had come down to seek justice, but as he pulled Cherish into a deep, sweeping kiss under the shattered stained glass, he knew he had found something far more precious. He had found his home. If this Wild West tale of resilience, heartbreak, and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this incredible story of Cherish and Huxley with your fellow romance and drama lovers. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired Western stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a twist, and leave a comment below with your favorite moment.